Hello, and welcome to a series of videos where we look inside the Figma product teams. Today, we have some developers, some designers, and we're going to be talking about craft. Laura, I'm going to come to you first. What's your definition of craft?
So when thinking about craft and product design, for me, craft starts when you have the ability to get off your screen and draw inspiration from nature, like industrial design, and bring this back to your Figma board, and that you kind of like stop benchmarking and following the kind of like set process of the industry, and you have your own process. Yeah.
So go outside, have a look around.
Yes.
Natalie, on the Figma side, as a designer, how do you approach craft when you're on your day-to-day?
I think it's attention to details. It's making sure it's like always part of like the main flow, and it's not like effort after. It's all part of the same things. Like you talk about like what is the bigger user problem, but then like to talk about error states and things like that is part of the main conversation as well.
So do you see it as a table stakes
Yeah.
to consider all edge cases, benchmarks, states as you mentioned? Do you do that as a checklist? Do you have an Asana board that you kind of check out every time you start a project? How does it manifest?
I feel like it's an ongoing list. It's very much talking to the team. I'm relatively new to Figma, so I feel like there's a lot of things I haven't thought through yet. So it's like talking to the team and making sure it's like, oh, there's this case, okay, let's add it to the list, and then you tackle as you go. But I put it just on my Figma board.
So there's no set method for each feature, it's kind of independent of what you're trying to build?
Yeah, I think everybody does like context, main flow, and then the edge cases. But in terms of like specific process that you follow, it's like very fluid depending on the team as well.
And on the engineering side, I'm sure you have maybe similar or maybe differing definitions of craft. Perhaps it's easier to show your craft with the tangible assets of code. So how do you approach it?
Yeah, I think like technically I think there's a certain baseline that you need in terms of like how are we guaranteeing like the quality of like the software that we're building on a technical sense. But I think kind of what elevates beyond that is like understanding the product and going more like outside of just the technology and understanding like the customer more, understanding the problem, making sure that like you're solving the right thing as an engineer rather than just building something. And I think that's maybe the nuance for me, where it's like building the right thing rather than necessarily building like something.
And he mentioned the word quality. Is that something you'd share? And also the building the right thing. So how would you approach the definition of right or definition of quality? Maybe they're the same, maybe they're different.
Yeah, I think part of the difficult part, but the part that needs to be, agreed upon and certain about is coming together, to determine what is the right thing. I think it takes time. It's worth spending that time as a team to get to the point where everybody agrees on what the right thing is, and that is, I think, part of a process defines good craft as well. And I would hope that, in many of the cases, you agree that the quality is a part of your definition of the right thing, and how you get about delivering that quality is different from team to team, product to product. But at the end of the day, I think many teams know. I feel like we know that quality is a huge proponent of the end experience for our users.
And how do you benchmark quality?
It's a big one. I think like on the engineering side, you can have kind of like how many bugs appear in the product, like what kind of customer feedback are you getting about it? Do they find it easy to use? There's even just like an engineering sense of like, are we proud of the thing that we're building, and like, do we feel like it works for our users? I think there's a ton of different metrics you can kind of look at. I don't know whether there's like a singular quality metric that you can point to and be like, aha, like we've nailed it. I think there's so many different places you can draw from, and I think ultimately I feel like the biggest signal is like what are the customers saying about your product, because they're ultimately, that's ultimately the measure, I guess. It's like, are people like really happy when they use the product? And like, for me, that's probably the biggest signal that like you've either met a quality bar or not. Yeah.
And what Scott said about there's so many different ways to approach that measurement that, you know, other perspectives on the team might have different ideas about not only what quality is, but like how to ensure it in different ways. And, you know, as an engineering manager, I think about how do I harness all those diverse perspectives in a team. And I think that is also a big part of craft, is thinking about what everyone is bringing to that craft, how different those perspectives are, and how do we create a space where those different ways of doing craft can all be combined into something that at the end of the day is going to be much better than any individual craft of one person could have achieved.
And as a design systems focused designer, you're sort of sometimes in the middle of the design and the engineering, definitions of quality, levels of quality, access to customers. How do you firstly ensure that that happens? And then secondly, make sure that it's of the benchmark that you expect as a systems team?
I think really this coming together and defining like what is the right thing to do is like super important, because often teams, not just design system teams, but also product teams, work very isolated, like designers and engineer, the product manager. But I think actually when you come together from the very first second, I think this is defining the quality.
And we're all talking about quality and systems now. Figma has a design system. Does that just make your job so much easier when you know that these have been designed, coded, tested for accessibility, the patterns work? Does that just sort of upskill you to a higher level off the bat?
100%. I think it's streamlined the process, because like I don't have to think like, oh, I have to make sure this button is accessible, this is the right blue or like the right green or anything like that. But like, we focus on other problems, and like we don't even have to think about that. So I feel like you have more like headspace to think about the full flow, making sure it like makes sense, and just, yeah, I think it just helps streamline it so much more.
As a designer, it's very difficult to sometimes define your craft or your level of quality outside of here's a design system I made, or here's a very rough file that shows every single piece of thinking that I've done. So as people who are hiring designers and people who are looking to get a job, how do you actually communicate that you have this higher level of craft when it's so difficult to be sort of tangible with it?
I think it's like, you don't have to show everything, but like you show the moments of delight. And I think it's like, there's always a specific thing in your product that like you feel proud of. And maybe it's not the most like shiny thing, but it's like a tiny detail that, I don't know, like the animation of this icon that makes it like magical. So I feel like I always like to talk about, okay, this is the problem we're doing, and this is how we solved it, this is how we measured. And then have like a tiny section that's like tiny details. And then we go like, okay, we wanted to add some delights because it's a celebration moment, and this is how we went through about it. And it's like 3 explorations, but like you time box it so you don't rabbit hole.
So just a moment of delight that you can showcase. Would you look at it in the same way from an engineering perspective? Your craft in your code. Someone can look at your repo and look at your files, but they probably wouldn't do that. So how do you showcase that you are meeting a high level of quality, and for somebody to easily grasp that?
Yeah, like during an interview, or I think like maybe going back to my earlier point, it's about showing that you're thinking about things beyond the implementation per se, and you're thinking about like both from like maybe like a longer term architectural viewpoint of like, here's how what we have built now will support these like future use cases, or like unblock us like prematurely going forward for like maybe later we want to extend this feature to do other things. And like we've thought about kind of the future customer problems and factored that into like the design now. Other ways you can maybe show that is just by, I don't know, I think it's a little bit harder from an engineering side, especially in an interview, because you're not like turning up with a portfolio. You don't really bring past code you've written at your past employer to the interview. If you do, you're probably breaking like an NDA or something, and you shouldn't do that. But like, I think an interesting one though, like for open source developers though, that is something that they showcase as a way to like, hey, like, and I think in that case, it's not just the code that they've written on like an open source project, it's look at how I've managed the project planning, like the feature discovery, engaging with customers, fixing bugs, or like proactively like engaging with the community. And so I think that piece is maybe an interesting insight into like how you can show the value of like the work that you're doing.
And as a manager of engineers, is that something you look for, is kind of almost not the code, but the outside of the code?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I was just about to add about kind of those descriptions of the way someone goes about their engineering, their work. I think for me is almost more important than what you have to show technically. I mean, obviously you have to meet a certain standard of technical understanding and skill set, but beyond that, I think it's so important that you can show as a candidate that you not only understand your craft, but you have an opinion about, you know, how you conduct that work and how you work within a team to develop that craft and deploy that, you know, your opinionated version of that craft, if that makes sense. And I think the best candidates really can show, especially during interviews like behavioral interviews, where you get a lot of time and opportunity to talk about specific instances that demonstrate your opinion about what is a good way to do something, what is, you know, kind of the strength of their craft. It's so valuable to see that from a candidate. It's so telling to be able to see kind of the passion and the drive of a candidate come through those stories when they talk about their craft, and that I think makes a huge difference.
And do you see the same as a former hiring manager of designers?
Totally, yeah. Like I think on design, it's like really or design system, like the small details. So what I'm really always looking for is like the intro text, like how do they present themselves? Are they going with, hey, I'm like a UX and UI designer, like kind of like this copy-paste sentence, or if they're kind of like talking about their grit, like where they're coming from, where they're aspiring, where the passion is coming from. Like this always like really grabs my attention. And then like it's the small details on like how do they solve a problem, like how do they bring the spark into the project. That's really important for me, yeah.
And as a person who was formerly applying for jobs, did you tell these kind of stories of here's the grid I used, or here's that like flourish or animation or delight that I added? Or was it more, here's an entire flow, here's the feature we were working on? How did you approach telling your story?
I think I always make sure that like, I tell the server like what was the problem and how we solved it and how we measure it, because for me that's table stakes. And then I go through the details, but I don't go through all the flows or anything like that, because I think it's going to be too much. It's more like, how do you tell this story? It has to be a good story, so you have to have an arc, right? This is where I started, this is where the problems were, but you don't rabbit hole into all the problems. You take like one big problem, this is how I tried to solve it, and then this is what was the outcome. And like in the middle, you do like, yeah, the tiny like sparks they had along the project. It might be at the end, it's like, we got this customer like review that was like, said something like really good about it. Or like, you talk about how it moved into like a system thing. Like I think there's a couple sparks that you can always highlight.
Those moments of delight you were
Yeah.
talking about before, yeah.
And looking internally, how do we meet in the middle of designers and engineers, of designer wanting to create some delight, engineering wanting to also do delight, but thinking about practical applications of these ideas? How do we clash or meet in the middle?
I think it's ideally, I think it's not really, there's not really a clash. I think that like some of the best designers I've worked with understand the engineering side enough that we're not dreaming of having like 3D rendered like UI that's spinning around. It's like, how can we like really build cool experiences into the product, thinking it through, like with the designer thinking of it through like an engineering lens, and then the engineer thinking of it through a design lens, and like that like shared empathy you get from that means that like you can actually come up with some pretty practical, delightful ideas because you have like that shared understanding.
And again, from the system side, sometimes you're the arbiter of how these things meet. because you have to rationalize them, you have to benchmark them, you have to test them for accessibility, and sometimes the edges can be maybe sanded down of an original idea. How can people maybe break out of that mentality and see that as a facilitator of the best ideas?
I think actually, like just like what you said, right? Like design system like sets the ground so you can open the door for innovation, right? Like all the standards are set, like everything is measured for accessibility, like it's tokenized, like all is said and done. So you don't need to think about those details and like can fully focus like together with design and engineering on like creating this innovation, getting to the 100%, right? We know 75% are possible, and now we come together for the last missing, like 25%, like the innovation, the spark. So yeah.
And as a designer, how do you make time? Do you make time for these extra moments of delight? Or do you see that as just something that you kind of have to do as a passionate designer?
It's sometimes hard. We just had a chat, I think, like yesterday about this actually, because we wanted to like, how do we bring more delight and like make sure. I think it's part of like quality, because like you don't want also to have like delights all the time that's like in your face, right? But like it's more leaning into the moments. So I think it's understanding the journey of a user and like where's the arcs. Like on one hand, like let's say you finished a project, it's a moment of celebration, so you can have just like a text, congrats, you've done it, but you can lean more into it. So I think it's just baking those moments into the project, but then also like leaving some time aside to like brainstorm different ways that you can make it even more like delightful. But it's tricky. It's tricky.
We've all seen the websites where there's animation everywhere, and we know that that's the end result of this extra flourish. So maybe paring it down to a touch or a flourish instead of it being the whole entire experience is just popping up all over the place. And as a designer, you work differently to engineers. You have different timelines. You may be working ahead of schedule. You may be working at a different pace with a different ticketing system, perhaps. How do you ensure that that idea that you maybe started a few weeks ago gets pushed into the production product in the way that you anticipated? What's the middle bit for you?
I think first is like making sure the team is as excited about the idea as you, because I think sometimes there's things that like one day you're like, oh, this is really good, but then actually it might be cringy. So I think like talking to the team, making sure you're all like on the same page and like on board. And then you have different people that will carry the torch across different elements, right? And I think that's part of quality. Like for animation, for example, there's always somebody who really cares about animations and making sure like all the tiny details are there. So I think it might be a designer, it might be an engineer, but like I think everybody has their own like special touch that they care about. So it's like harnessing that within the team. So if somebody is really passionate about animations, it's like always chatting with them. It's like, oh, how we can add them. And then if they're super passionate about it, they'll like also like push it forward. In terms of system, like ticketing and all that stuff, I think it depends on your team process. I think right now I just like add everything to my canvas. And then we chat as a team was like, okay, let's make it happen.
Your design file is your planning board, effectively.
Yeah.
And how have you approached it in the past? How do you meet in the middle of these ideas?
I think right from the start, like planning for kind of like delightful moments. So when you come together, a project starts, you like rebuild a component, you already agree at the beginning, like what would be like the ideal like masterpiece for everyone, for like design, engineering, the product manager, and then like building in those like ideation times for that, like aligning, okay, what can we do in the time frame, and where do we start to like build in like those quality, cherries on top.
And how do you as an engineer approach that without it feeling like extra work, or that you've been in more meetings or in more Slack channels? How do you facilitate that and ensure that you're still centrally meeting quality and a high bar, but potentially at the sacrifice of more time building the product?
Yeah, I think a lot of teams struggle with this, where it's around like how like balancing like business like deadlines or like timelines to like launch projects against like you know, how delightful is it going to be? Is it going to be like 100% of a fit for customers day one, or are we going to have to like iterate on it as we get feedback? I'm not sure I necessarily have the answer. I think it's a matter of one, like engineering team feeling empowered to like push back on their product and design partners to advocate for that quality, because ultimately like engineers are the one that kind of like safeguard that, in a sense, from like they're the one to have to like live with like the technical debt that's introduced if we like cut corners and shave off time, etc. But also like they're probably best placed to understand like the impact or the immediate like product fault from like an engineering perspective. So I feel like as engineers we should be feeling comfortable and empowered to like talk to our PMs and our designers and our team to advocate for like, hey, like, or at least raise these issues and say like, hey, like I'm not sure that this is necessarily meeting our quality bar, or like, hey, like I think we're nailing it, like what else can we do? Like I think it's not just one or the other, like you can do both.
What Scott was just talking about saying that actually we might not have all the answers, I think that is, in an ironic way, a description of a team that has good craft. I think a lot of the signs that tell you that a team has good craft is the team has a shared understanding about this process that is messy, that is amorphous, and despite that, they're able to dive into a challenge that is, you know, to do with something very new or something very technically challenging, or, you know, something that, yes, like it's daunting, but we're going to dive into it anyway as a team. We're going to trust each other and still, at the end of the day, come out with something that's worth delivering and putting in front of customers and users. I think that shows me that that team understands and has good craft. Yeah.
And unity.
Yeah.
Not necessarily you do the design, we do the engineering, we do the product. It's the central team, which at the start might be really messy and might be non-linear as a process, but we look at processes like the shining light of success. So how do you kind of unblock this messy start to enable people to sprint further in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like the holy grail to management, right? It's like, how do you craft a team that can operate in that way that succeeds in the long term? There's of course many ways to approach it, but in my opinion, at the fundamental baseline level, it comes down to trust. You know, you have to spend the time. It's kind of like the saying, you know, you have to go a little bit slower to go fast later. Like you have to spend the time in the beginning establishing a sense of trust and understanding within the team and all the members, so that they can build everything else on top of that. Because if you don't have trust, if you don't have an environment where people feel safe to truly collaborate in the way that they feel comfortable and comfortable to share opinions, then it's really hard to dive into a messy process. It's hard to work in a place where the challenges are going to require you to be flexible and grasp with something amorphous. So at the end of the day, I think that is what it really comes down to.
I think it's also having the space for bad ideas. Because I feel like there is a way of like, oh, we want to show only the good ideas. But how do you get to a good idea if you're in a messy space? I think you have to like have a space that you just like slap everything on a wall and like you analyze it together, right? But like, it's okay, everybody's on the like same page. It's like, it doesn't say anything about you. It's like, okay, let's like work through what's bad about this idea, what is good about this idea. And then you like iterate through that. But I think it's just like, the space for it is really needed.
Do you think that facilitating that discussion around bad ideas effectively is paramount to building really successful teams? And how do you actually get people into the frame of mind of being comfortable with an idea not being the best straight away?
I mean, making the ground like so nobody is afraid to fail. I think like out of failure, like comes the best craft, the highest quality, and like actually like making failing something good. Like as a former manager, right? Like this is like, yeah, building the ground for like trust in the team, and then like people are open to like say everything they think might be a good idea, and then if it's not, like everyone is fine with that, and also iterating along the line. Like often in the beginning you think that's really great, and you already start to build it, and then like in the middle of building, after design is already on something new, you're like, oh, this actually not works, so back to the drawing board. And if everyone is comfortable with that, I think this is very important.
I think that's quite a common scenario for projects that we work on, is sometimes that idea might not make it to production. As an engineering leader, how do you buy that space so that people can be comfortable knowing that if they don't get it to production, that's actually fine. It's not going to be the end of the world, and we can move on to something more successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to setting expectations correctly, in the beginning, and that's true for, I think, any successful venture, but really important if you want the team to be resilient to changes. And as we know, there's always changes in the process. It might be due to factors you can't control. So for the team to understand that we are operating in such an environment, setting the expectations correctly, that that's our end goal isn't always to deliver something, get it out there, and call it done. It's more about what we learn in the process of getting there is just as important. I think that's true in many levels, whether you're talking about specifically, engineers learning as they work on the work, as well as like the team and the company learning more about the product, the market. At each one of those levels, I think that's true. But of course, at the end of the day, like you want something to show for your work, and you want to feel like you made an impact. But setting the expectations correctly at the beginning, that maybe that's not what we get to do every day, and sometimes we'll have to go back to the drawing board before we can show that impact. But as long as the team, again, going back to that trust, trusts each other that it's okay to live in that space and iterate and come back to it, I think that still leaves room for a lot of success.
And presumably, sometimes you revisit these ideas. You might build something, it doesn't make it to production, but that might come back to life later on.
Yeah, I think June nailed it with the fact that we're as engineers or as a product team, we're here to build great product, not great features. And I think it's okay for maybe to get halfway through the process and realize it's not necessarily what we should be shipping, and go back to the drawing board. I've definitely worked on projects where we've shipped things in the past at other companies where maybe in hindsight I would have just cancelled it halfway through, because you understanding kind of when things can fail, and when maybe you don't need to add more features to add more value. Maybe there's other levers you can pull around improving existing features, or changing, focusing on different areas. I think fundamentally, we want to make a great product experience, and I think definitely teams sometimes can get locked into well, if I don't ship this feature, or if we don't ship this milestone, then we've failed, or our team has failed. But I think that's the wrong mindset. If you don't ship a feature because you decide it's the wrong thing to do, or if you decide that it's the wrong thing to do, then that's a good thing. It means you're strategically not making it so the company has to spend a lot of time maintaining code for 0.01% of users that's never going to get used, that makes the software a lot more complicated. There's so many benefits to not shipping features that aren't actually that useful.
How do you build confidence in a team to be comfortable with that we're building products, not individual features, when we sometimes are given tickets to execute and deliver, and without necessarily seeing the wider picture?
And that's a hard one. I think it's this is something that then also really depends on the organization. I don't think this can happen on team level. Sure, you as a manager can kind of isolate your team in a way and be okay, we don't just focus on this component or this feature. We try to see it in the whole product context. But if you look into product teams, they're often very focused on this one single specific thing, and they don't see the whole context, which then often makes features fail. So I think it needs to come actually from C-level, and they need to be hey, don't think about this one button on this one page. Think about all the buttons and the whole product.
I think this is maybe one of the single most challenging things about how to make an organizational succeed, or how to make an organization succeed. And as you mentioned, it's usually not just about the team. And from a manager's perspective, it's very important to be plugged into kind of the context of what's happening around the team, so you can be a conduit to having the team absorb some of that information or context through you. But at the end of the day, I think it's so evident looking at places that have a culture where that kind of outside the team collaboration, or just a simple mindset shift of like, we're not just independent teams working on things that may later add up to something that is under a single domain. It's more that we are actually one big team, and we should think of ourselves that way in an organization. And if you empower individuals to have that mindset, I think places with that kind of culture, it's so much more evident what more they can do and how much more easily or more naturally they can collaborate.
I think one way to do that is like through dogfooding, because like other teams that are not yours are also using your own products, and then you see how all the pieces fit together, and you see like the seams. So I feel like it's easier to spot those things and like, oh, let's work together on this and like make it happen. So I feel like dogfooding your own products is actually like a really good way to do that.
I think a hard part as well is it's very tempting to structure teams around like the code complexity, or like around like a feature, because it makes it easier to like, okay, these people are working on our like API, or these people are working on like the design system, or like this specific page in a product, and it kind of makes that a little bit more siloed, where it's like, okay, well, if I'm like the editor team, then I work on editor features and I'm focused on like optimizing that. And like and it's good because you like allow the team to like not worry about all those other pieces, but it's an inherent risk when you focus in on that you lose in the boundaries between those teams. There's a lot of experiences that get missed.
There's like a law, Conway's
Conway's
law.
law,
You
yeah.
ship your org chart, right?
Yeah.
Like that's really hard actually in reality to avoid that. Yeah.
And that's a lovely place for us to stop. As a designer, think about the details, the flourishes in your design to level up your design organization. As an engineer, think about the stories around your code. And as a product team, think about building great products, not individual features. We'll see you in the next video.